Hello all, good morning. Thank you very much for being with us here today. We have the honor to host Professor Daniel Isenberg, a well-known and renowned personality, talking about scale-up and the creation of the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Creating the ecosystem, which you can see, is our main strategic aim of SECE, MAC, and all the associations that participate in this project together with Technology Innovations. And we are very honored to have Daniel Isenberg today with us. We think that having a discussion with such a personality and a man of such experience and knowledge in this field would help us move forward some of our ideas and some of our projects that aim to flourish the ecosystem of innovation and entrepreneurship in Athens and maybe in some other areas around Greece and around the Mediterranean. I would like, before we make the opening, to ask Socrates, the president of the Hellenic Startup Association, to give us some points, because Socrates and Dimitris Tsikos, who is not with us today as in Brussels, were the initiators of this event. The personal communication of Dimitris with Dan Isenberg was the initiating force for grabbing Dan out of his vacation trip and bringing him in Athens. And thank you, Dan, for being with us. Socrates.
Good evening. Just a small note. First of all, we'd like to thank you for being here. It's in the middle of the day. It's quite hot outside. Basically, we would really like to thank Dr. Isenberg for being around and really helping us understand a little bit more the concept of scale-up. I just want to point out one thing and how the Hellenic Startup Association is looking at this scale-up thing and what is important for us and what is the message for us. First of all, we believe that we are in the middle of a new narrative. Startup has already started for around 3 years in Greece. We are looking good, we are not good yet. We have a long way to go, but the most important thing is that what we really need to do now, not as a startup association, but as an ecosystem that is under discussion, we have to grow and to become a scale-up ecosystem, which means that we really need to grow really big, strong companies out of the ecosystem as it is now. We definitely have to do that. But the key word here, and this is our message, and this is our message to everybody we talk to, is the word transformation. It's not change. Since the last 4 years that we're talking so much about the crisis and what needs to be done. We say Greece needs to change, and Greece needs to change and change and change. No, the word is not change. We need to transform. We need to change the fundamentals. We need to transform everything that is up to now done the way that it is done. So Dan is going to present for us the concept which, in our opinion, is the most interesting concept as far as we are concerned in the last couple of years, which is the scale-up concept. I really want to thank you and thank him again. Sorry for the time I took, but I really wanted to get the message through. So Dan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. It is a pleasure to be here. I'm going to, first of all, try to make sure I have the technology working, because this is a very sophisticated piece of equipment. I'm Dan Isenberg. I want to have a discussion with you about entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship ecosystems. As Giannis and Socrates both said, this is an important topic, I gather.
better.
Is this better? Okay. I'm going to try and adjust it because I like to move and talk. And if at any time you can't hear me or if I get out of range of the cameraman, just please just tell me. And I would like to start off by just understanding a little bit about who you are as people. How many of you are entrepreneurs or consider yourself entrepreneurs, for example? How many of you, about half to two-thirds, and how many of you consider yourselves in support organizations that support entrepreneurship? A few. Anybody who's primarily would say, I'm an investor or a provider of capital? One, maybe two or three other people. It's also important for them to know who you are. Now that you've identified yourself, you can get more inquiries than I do. Is there anybody who represents here the public sector? The city of Athens? Okay. And then anybody here represent, let's say, the university or education? You can raise your hand more than once, obviously, but any professor, researcher, okay, 3 or 4. And then I guess last, would anybody here identify themselves as being affiliated with or part of a large, or a relatively large corporation or established corporation of any kind? So at least we have 1 or 2 people representing all different parts of what I call, or almost all different parts of the ecosystem. And that's important for me to know because, as you know, entrepreneurship is an extraordinarily broad topic. And this concept of ecosystem is it's a relatively new concept as it's applied to entrepreneurship. I think it's a very important one. I think one of the things I want to do with you is have a conversation so that we understand that better. After introducing myself, and feel free to at any time interrupt, I'll tell you if I'll answer your question later, but I think this is a chance to have a conversation amongst ourselves. So I do have a lot of slides. But I don't get paid more if I get through the slides. I get paid exactly the same. Actually, I get paid twice as much if I get through half the slides. The conversation, if I do get through my slides, has 2 parts to it. One part, the shorter part, is a brief discussion with you of what entrepreneurship is, because we use the word, but it's very rare for people to discuss what that means. So we're going to have a little bit of a discussion about what entrepreneurship is. And then I will present my own viewpoint. And the second part of the discussion will be how do we foster in a rapid and systematic way, regardless of the environment or how bad the macroeconomy is. What are the opportunities to stimulate a region so there actually is more entrepreneurship? I think that a lot of you are doing already. I've just read over the last 24 hours of some of the interesting ventures and the interesting investments that have been done in ventures in Athens primarily, or with Greeks who maybe are in the diaspora but have some operation here in Greece as part of their venture. So, with no further ado, I'll try to introduce myself briefly. The older I get, the longer, it's kind of a double-edged sword. The older I get, the longer I have things to introduce, but the more I forget. So it ends up being about the same. So I've been a professor myself. I've represented many of the identities that you gave yourselves when I asked who you are. I've been a venture capitalist, a general partner of one of 4 general partners of $75 million IT, primarily IT software components fund that invested in the Series A. For those of you who understand, very early stage risky ventures. I was an entrepreneur, built and ran a company for 15 years in Israel, and became a global company. I've been, since that time, a very active angel investor, and I still have a very active angel, private investor portfolio. I don't know why they call, actually I do know why they call them angels. It's a really undeserved term, but it's stuck. It comes from the film industry about 100 years ago. I've actually been an author, and I wrote the book Worthless, Impossible, and Stupid. And More personally, I've been in the field of entrepreneurship for 3 years. I'm not looking over there just because I'm tethered, invisibly tethered to the microphone. But I've been through a lot personally. These are not everything I've been through, but it does not include any police record. But I've been through, experienced myself 2 economic collapses. I've been involved in them as an actor and as a sufferer. So those of you who are experiencing, all of you, I guess, all of us are experiencing the most recent economic collapse. There was a mini, more sectoral collapse in the year 2001. I can see from the gray hair out in the audience that some of you have experienced that as well. They're very different, but still very painful in a lot of ways. Several currency devaluations, which you're not experiencing. I guess it depends on what happens in Greece, whether you will or won't. I've been through a few wars myself, and as I say, 2 passports, and I've had, as an entrepreneur, 1 success and 1 failure. I have some things to say about the current view that failure is a good thing. Having failed, I think it's a terrible thing. I was more successful than I failed, thank God. And it's one of the things that entrepreneurs should try to avoid doing if they can. So you'll hear me voice quite a few opinions, and they're not just opinions, they're assessments today that'll be a little bit controversial, a little bit out of your, all of our comfort zones. One of my jobs as an educator is to keep people out of their comfort zones, including myself. And I think that, as you use the word Socrates, transformation, it's virtually impossible to have any kind of social transformation and feel comfortable. Anxiety is intrinsically bound up in the process of change. Thank you, that's really good. As long as there's no feedback. Is that okay? So as we go along, and because time is limited, these are extraordinarily complicated things that we're dealing with, the phenomenon of entrepreneurship and using it as a wedge for economic growth and development. These are extraordinarily complicated things. We have a few minutes to talk about these things, so by definition, not only am I going to be a little bit controversial just to stimulate thinking, but secondly, I'm going to oversimplify, because it's very difficult to do justice to the complexity of real-life phenomena in a short period of time. So I'm very, very well aware of the fact that some of these ideas are both much more complicated and they're very nuanced. But I'll say them in a non-nuanced way in order to be clear and generate conversation. So that's important for me anyway. So we'll be out. I'll then start off with the tale of 2 people, one of whom you probably have heard of. I can't solve that problem. Maybe I can. One of them you may have heard of is of Greek origin, Dean Kamen. The other one you probably haven't. And let's start off with Dean Kamen. How many of you have heard the name? And also, it tells a little bit about how well you might do it. Dean Kamen was extremely successful, has been an extremely successful inventor and commercializer of his inventions. And he made a lot of money. Some of the things that he invented were a portable kidney dialysis machine over here, and he invented some exoskeletal medical devices. He also invented and sold, I should say, made, as I say, made a lot of money. Then he invented something which is a wheelchair that actually climbs stairs, and it's used in some cases. And about 1999, there was a buzz that started buzzing around Silicon Valley, and he's from the Northeast United States, New Hampshire, and my area. But there's a buzz around Silicon Valley about this new thing that he was developing that would, it was codenamed Ginger, it was kept very secret, codenamed Ginger, and he put himself $50 million into this Ginger. And it got a lot of buzz. It was going to revolutionize the human transportation, the transportation industry. The internet, according to John Doerr, I don't know if John Doerr was partner with Kleiner Perkins, a very big venture capital fund in the West Coast, said this would be much bigger than the internet. And he ended up raising a lot of money from some very, very interesting people, including Credit Suisse. But he also raised money from Steve Jobs and his say John Doerr and Jeff Bezos, put a lot of money into this together. Of course, what I'm talking about is the Segway. And you've all seen the Segway. I can only imagine that you have city tours in Athens or in some parts of Athens where you see people with helmets going along. But about 4 or 5 years later, after he raised this $137 million, a lot of news started coming out about how bad the Segway was as a business. And it was listed as one of the 10 worst inventions of the decade, one of the 50 worst inventions of all time, and so on and so forth. To hype the disaster, you can see the headlines. And in 2006, Dean Kamen was fired as CEO. A number of other things happened. They raised some money from the Qataris, and from the Emiratis, and but they couldn't raise all the money that they needed to get going. The company was eventually sold to a fellow named Jimmy Heselden, who was found dead, a UK businessman, Irish, and he was found dead at the bottom of a cliff in Ireland with a Segway next to him. No one really knows whether he had a heart attack and then fell, or whether he drove his Segway off a cliff, but he died. And his assets were sold off, auctioned off, and eventually bought by a very obscure private equity fund in southeastern United States called Summit Strategic Investments. If you Google them, you find absolutely nothing about them, except that they're repositioning Segway. That's when it became better known as a tourist, a couple of issues, tourism and security, so you see it in airports as well. That's Segway, and I guess the first question is, when you think of Dean Kamen, how perfect of an example, or how prototypical of an example of entrepreneurship do you think Dean Kamen was? I see it's nodding, I see it's shaking. He created a lot of buzz, and that means that's more entrepreneurial?
That's the main thing.
You think so? Awareness?
Everybody, especially in Greece, but certainly around the world, is talking about traction. Everybody
You're not talking about the traction Segway, but
yes, I'm talking to...
You got into the market.
Yes, traction.
You got into the market.
Even this whole thing is...
It was nothing. The whole thing is nothing.
Even if the...
So what do you mean by that? So what's traction mean?
Yes.
Is that buzz, awareness, users, even if you don't make money?
It was all right.
It was all right. You gave him a passing grade in the middle of
He's
somewhere.
at the top of the pyramid.
Sorry?
He's at the top of the pyramid because Segway is just a small thing among what he did.
It was a small
thing among what he did.
of all the things that he did.
Yeah, I mean,
So this was not
he's God.
any different, completely different opinions about whether this was on there. But the fact that he put $50 million of his own money into Segway means that he made $50 million from his other activities. He commercialized other inventions. So is that important? Believe me, he didn't put all the money. He still has a helicopter. Does the fact that he essentially wiped out burned up $137 million of investment, does that make him a better or worse entrepreneur? More prototypical or less prototypical as an entrepreneur?
It doesn't make him not anything. I mean, you cannot quantify his success unless if you know what the worth of it.
But you can quantify his success, but you can quantify his failure, because we know that he burned through. We can guess pretty easily that when Summit Ventures came in, they bought some assets very cheaply. He burned up $137 million. His investors, John Doerr, Jeff Bezos, my colleague at Harvard Business School, they lost all their money. So we can quantify the consumption of value. It's hard to quantify the creation of value here. Does that matter?
Do you want to differentiate between inventor and entrepreneur? Is that what
Well, this is what was raised over here as an inventor, but here he obviously invented something that was successful. In the past, not only did he invent things, but he sold them. So he was at least in the past, was much more than an inventor. Whether he's an entrepreneur or not, I don't know. But he made a lot of money, like Thomas Edison, who was an incredible inventor, became extraordinarily wealthy from his inventions. And you're right in saying that that's not the same thing. Inventing and making a lot of money are not necessarily go together. A lot of inventors die poor. So I'll give you another example who probably no one has ever heard of. His name is Robert Weston. At the same time, oh, you know. Oh, how do you know him?
I don't know him personally, I know of him.
Oh, okay.
Which is actually a big name, you know, because of the Icelandic financial crisis, and you know, there's like this multi-billionaire that was involved with this company.
Yes, Thor. The other,
Yes.
So he just wrote a book. He just wrote a book, Thor. Okay, we can go into that later. I know Robert very well. Same, a little bit younger than Robert, than Dean Kamen at the time. 29 years old. He came back to Iceland after working in Germany for a shipping company, and bought into a generic pharmaceutical company, which became called Activist over time. And I'll just give you some numbers. He didn't start the company. The company was about 30 years old, had 3 drugs, as I say, generics, about 90 employees, 14 million euro in revenue, and was 2 weeks away from bankruptcy. This was before the crisis. This was just bad management. 2 weeks away from closing the doors because of illiquidity. He came in at 29. 8 years later, and there are no typographical errors here in terms of extra zeros or extra numbers. 8 years later, there were 11,000 employees, number 5 in the world in generics. Today it's number 2 or number 3, depending on how you count, in generics. And presence in, I choose 2007 because actually he left in 2008. He left Activist. But, and I wrote the case. I published the case on this. It's also in my book. With over 11,000 employees, 26, actually 32. Every acquisition was a successful acquisition. $1.6 billion of sales, and about the same equity value, etc. So, and by the way, he went in 2008. He founded a new company. It's now called Alphagen. Alphagen, his second company, he didn't found either. He created out of existing assets. And it's 5th year of existence. We're writing a case as well. 2014, they closed the books with $500 million in revenues. 5 years from this start. So, I guess I should say this, that before you get fantasies about what Robert Weston did, there was nothing innovative in what he did. Generic pharmaceuticals is, by definition, a non-innovative product. And the playbook for being successful in generic pharmaceuticals was and still is, to a large extent, known to all the players. Everybody knows exactly what the key success factors are. You succeed by execution. So it's a pure execution play. If you can get to the market faster than your competitors, you'll get 50% market share and they'll get 5% market share. If it's a matter of a week or 2 weeks difference in this industry. So there's nothing innovative here about either the process or the certainly not the product. And so now I'll ask you to compare which is the better. This is slightly, in some ways easier, slightly in some ways more difficult task. Which was the more prototypical example of an entrepreneur? Are they, is one more than the other? And before you say both, because I have this conversation a lot with people, before you say both, I'm going to exclude that as a possibility, because they are diametrically opposed. Every single thing they did was different. Dean Kamen was innovative, putting his personal wealth, was risk-taking, it was a startup, he accepted failure, he lost money, he didn't achieve his vision, and he was a bad executor. Robert Weston was exactly, precisely the opposite. He was a copycat, he had no personal wealth that he invested in the company. If there's one thing that he doesn't like to do, it's fail. He hates, I know, I'm telling you this is a fact. If there's one person who hates failure, it's Robert Weston. He didn't start up the company, he used existing assets, he made a lot of money. He lost $250 million overnight, I'm sure in the crash in October 6th in Iceland, 2008, but still had some assets left over, not much. Achieved market success, created value for shareholders, etc. So Dean Kamen and Robert Weston, with some very minor exceptions, they're both men. They both started in 1999, but they're completely opposite from each each other. What vision of entrepreneurship that you have that includes them both? So if you can, then which one, who is the more typical entrepreneur? The non-innovative, execution-based, non-startup, or the startup, innovation, no execution, who raised a lot of money and created a lot of buzz, a tremendous amount of buzz.
The prototypical is the delicate from what we see around. Which one is more like a turnover wizard, someone that goes to a company and creates value through financial decisions, etc.
Well, this wasn't financial, this was through execution. Marketing, operations, management, manufacturing.
It's like needing to be the CEO of
So you're saying this is entrepreneurial. Even if you completely destroy value, you don't succeed in the market, you can't translate the buzz into money, and then that's what entrepreneurs are. You're saying that's what entrepreneurs do.
This is what is the common idea for risk taking.
Not your idea, just the common idea.
Okay.
What's your idea?
From a financial decision, I believe that everything must, the numbers must support it. Yeah. My thought is continuous.
Actually, made a different question. The one that you were asking before was about personification.
You see, there's always one in every class. There's a very smart guy who says, you actually ask two different questions. Two different questions. The first and the second were different.
So personification is obviously over the wisdom of an entrepreneur per se, whereas thinking product development wise or innovation wise, a risk taker is a better risk taker. Again, we're not sure. Better risk taker.
But maybe the conclusion is that innovation is not intrinsic to the process of entrepreneurship. Maybe the conclusion is that risk-taking is not intrinsic to the process of entrepreneurship.
Wait a minute, it's a matter of definition. It's a matter of definition as always.
It is, and the only thing I'll let you finish, but the only thing I'll say, yes, it's a matter of definition, but that's important. Definitions are important because they guide what we do as a collectivity. I'm sorry.
Exactly the point. I mean, that's how you define innovation, that's how you define entrepreneurship. If entrepreneurship is about an enterprise, then clearly you have to go to the right. If entrepreneurship is about innovation, then you have to go to the left. So I think it depends how you define it.
So I will argue.
I'm sorry, Professor. You picked two examples, two instances. Right. And the question is, if I tried the left thing 10 times or 1,000 times and the right thing 1,000 times, which one would come out then? Two instances don't really matter.
The answer is, I don't know if these are generic recipes. These are recipes that can be taken. Robert Wesson's done it now twice out of 2 times. So.
And I can pick people that have done it 50 times on the website.
Yes, and there are many people, including myself, who've done it on the website. Let's continue. Let me go on and give you my own, because I think they're dramatic. I think there are dramatic implications of this example. And it goes back to the comments that were made at the opening about scale-up, about how the dialogue around growth has to be an intrinsic part of the dialogue of entrepreneurship. The dialogue of scale, of growth, of value creation has to be part of the discussion of entrepreneurship. And some of these implications directly address that issue. And one is that entrepreneurship. These are my opinions. And I agree that it's a question of definition. I think that I can justify my opinions, at least most of them, in terms of their being useful. There's one of the ways of judging whether a definition is good, one of the ways is good or not, is whether it's useful, whether it allows you to do something that a different definition doesn't allow you to do. And I think the definition of entrepreneurship that I will provide to you allows you to do things that another definition that's more innovation and startup related doesn't allow you to do. It doesn't preclude innovation, but it doesn't rely on it. And I realize saying that INNOVATHENS is somewhere between risky and foolish, because I may be not allowed to leave the country or may to leave the country much sooner. I'm not sure which. But innovation is a tool sometimes, not always. So it's intrinsically growing. Secondly, it's about growing up and not starting up. In fact, and I'll say more about this later, possibly, you can actually show fairly, both empirically and logically, that the more new companies you have in any economy, the fewer growing companies you have in that same economy. That's an empirical fact. California, just as an example, is very, very low in the number of new company registrations. Interesting. So is Massachusetts, very low in new company formation on a pro rata basis. By the way, Greece is fairly high, for what that's worth. So it's real, and you can also logically, not only empirically, but logically, the activity in an economy of starting up registering new ventures, or starting up new companies, and the activity of growing them, they have the characteristics of a zero-sum game. The more of one you have, the less of the other. And the main reason for that is they both use up the most important resource for growing a company, that's people. They both consume people. So a scaling up company removes startup potential from the labor market. Starting up company removes human potential, human capital from the growing company markets. Now, one second. What I said is in general, it's a logical argument. In a completely frictionless, I'm allowing myself to be a little bit academic here, in a completely frictionless economy, they wouldn't be. Only problem is there is no such thing as a completely frictionless economy.
If we have an inclusive business model.
The question is, if you have an inclusive business model, these are words, I'm going to ask gentlemen what those words mean. That's not true. What do you mean by inclusive business model?
That you should include all the stakeholders in your model, in your business model. People, buyers, consumers, everyone.
Let me sharpen it and see if it's not just a question of semantics. That, if we decide, if we're an economy together, we're 110, 120 people, whatever, if we decide that we are an economy and we begin to grow companies together, and it's a fixed economy, if we do that, then if I'm successful and I don't just create buzz, but I also actually create growth, and I'm selling lots of segways, and I'm having lots of tours and so on, I'm going to want to hire half the people in this room. And if I don't hire them, I won't be able to grow. Those half people will not be starting up companies because they'll be working for me. That's what I mean. Now, do you still think that that's not an inclusive model for some reason?
No, it is, but we have limited resources, but then that's not true in our
The one resource, if you talk to entrepreneurs around the world, and I've done this in well over 40 countries around the world, you talk to people who are growing companies, by far, the scarcest and most valuable resource that limits or enhances their growth is the ability to hire people. Everywhere in the world, whether it's Boston or Tanzania or Israel or anywhere, the biggest obstacle that comes to growth is people. And some of you are growing companies, you need to hire 10 IT people who know iOS 8, and you say, oh my God, I can't find those 8 people. You know, one of the reasons, and I'm exaggerating, one of the reasons you can't find those 8 people, this is absolutely true in Israel, is because they're starting companies. That's one of the reasons. So, as I say, these are complex things. I'm trying to get this all the thing. Number 3 is typically entrepreneurship is an incremental process. It's not a disruptive process. Even you look at the famous so-called disruptive technology, a few are really disruptive. And by the way, I don't treat disruptive as a negative thing. It's not a positive thing. By definition, intrinsically, the definition of disruption is negative. But it's typically incremental. If you look at even such as the iPad and iPod and iTunes and so on, all of these were business models that were tried, and there were incremental changes, something that I call innovation, small tweaks. Was that? Sorry?
No, nothing.
experience helps. And I was trying to imagine the audience that would be here today, because it's affiliated somehow. It got in my mind that this was something related to the university, and I was imagining people who would be about 15 years younger than the people in this room. And I'm really happy to see that the people here apparently have a lot of life experience and possibly a lot of business experience as well. And that's helpful. The glorification of youth as being beneficial to entrepreneurship primarily is the result of 2008 and the lack of employment opportunities. And we justified that after the fact, post hoc, we justified that as being young people being better entrepreneurs. But that's that post hoc justification of them not having jobs and having to choose between a career when you graduate. Everyone promised you, or your kids, my kids, when they graduated from school, they have job opportunities. And here they are graduating in 2009 from the best schools in the world with the best educations, and they have the following career choices. One career choice, do a master's degree. Career choice, do a master's degree. Career choice of going to work for an established company doesn't exist. So second, I can go live with my mother on her couch and reclaim my old room as a kid. Number three, I can be unemployed. And number four, I can be a startup. So given those four career options, choosing a startup, usually in combination with living on my mother's couch, is oftentimes chosen. Let me go a little bit faster, and then we'll keep going back and forth with the conversation. But my statement about entrepreneurship is that it's always about economic value creation. I think, by the way, that over time that's inclusive. But it's over time. Because you can show very clearly, I've done an economic analysis of Silicon Valley and all the exits of Facebook and Google. And if there's one thing that's clear that they created massive inequality almost overnight. This incredible entrepreneurial success of Facebook and the 3,000 millionaires overnight, many of them, a few of them billionaires, created in their environment extraordinarily powerful economic dynamics, including massive inequality. And if you could somehow do a Gini coefficient for Silicon Valley, which you can't, you would see it skyrocketing to be one of the most extraordinarily unequal environments in the world. Nevertheless, it's always about economic, I would claim, value creation. And when more companies grow faster in a given region, the economies have no choice but to grow. I'm not saying that's the only driver, but you will not have, I've not yet seen a region with sustained economic growth that doesn't have indigenous companies more and more growing rapidly, more and more rapidly. Yes?
I'm wondering, does entrepreneurship drive growth, or does innovation drive growth?
I think it depends on what time scale. Over long time scales, there's no doubt that innovation drives growth. Over long time scales, but not in short ones.
And what is your scale?
This is a scale, I'll show you. My scale is 5 years. Or less. So, I realize I'm jumping. This is the second part of the conversation, and again, I'm sure that many of you are saying, "Wait a second, I'm not sure I totally agree with all of those statements," and that's okay. That's okay, because as I say, these are conversations that take not days, not hours, not weeks, months and years to have until you realize that. So the question, this very practical question, that is, how should a vision of high aspiration, growth-oriented, growth-driven, growth-defined. And there are several words that I'll use almost interchangeably. One is scale up, a second is growth, a third is extraordinary value creation. All those, I think, represent our proxies for more or less the same thing. How can this be translated into an impactful economic policy? And so now I'm switching from the discussion of what entrepreneurship is, because we have to have that discussion if we want to talk about what it does. And now the second is what does it do and how to create more of it. By the way, there's a lot of research that shows that that high growth companies in a given region, it shows that the massive amounts or percentage portion of job creation and other kinds of social and economic value creation comes from those few companies that grow very rapidly. Regardless of how old they are, regardless of how innovative they are, regardless of what sector they're in, the job creation, there was just a study done in the United States released a couple of weeks ago by Dun & Bradstreet. They surveyed 19 of the 26 million companies in the United States. And they looked over the last 8 years, and saw that 92% of the net jobs were created by companies with revenues between $10 million and $1 billion of revenues. They call them mid-market companies. And the average age of those companies was 40 years. 92% of the net job creation. That kind of study, by the way, has been replicated in many countries and many kinds of economies around the world. And the notion that startups create jobs, and some of you have said it, and I've said it in the past as well, I'm among the guilty. The notion, the statement that startups create jobs has both empirical problems and conceptual problems. And it is not a useful guide. It is not a useful guide to policy or social change. The notion, the idea that startups create jobs. By the way, New York Economic Development Corporation created a program of 65 co-working spaces about 3 years ago. They announced it last year. And they said within 12 months, this would create 2,000 jobs in New York City. A report was published just a few days ago that showed that there were 76 jobs created so far. And the cost of creating those jobs, the denominator matters, by the way. It's not just enough to look at the numerator. The numerator is a little pale, 76. But the denominator was it cost $28 million just to advertise that program. So imagine, this is a thought experiment, imagine an economy or a city, a region, that has about 1 million people. It could be 3 or 4 million, it could be 500,000, but a fairly concentrated region. And imagine the following outcomes. You see 3 years later, and I'm not telling you how yet, but you see 3, 4, maybe 5 years later, that dozens and dozens of firms are growing. Instead of 5%, they're growing at 10%. Instead of 10 and 20, instead of 20, they're growing at 25 and 30%. Great, dozens. The manufacturers are expanding their facilities. Local ventures are winning their first export contracts. Banks are increasing. I don't see any. Are there any bankers in the group? There's one banker in a bank. There's one person from a bank. Banks are really the unsung heroes of entrepreneurship ecosystems. And when I tell people, bring bankers into the room because they're an important part of the dialogue, people scratch their heads and say, why do we need bankers? They don't invest in startups. I say, right, but they do invest in growth. If you look at what happened in Boston 40 years ago, it was the banks, as much as the venture capitalists, in fact, working with the venture capitalists, that stimulated the tech entrepreneurship in the Boston area. Banks. Bank is not it's a 4-letter word, but it's not a bad one necessarily. And of course, you can blame the banks for all kinds of things. You can blame ourselves for things as well. So they increase their loan portfolios. The equity investors are making more investments. Universities are having different kinds of courses in growth, not just starting up companies, not just business plan pitches and competitions. The media, who are also an important part of the ecosystem because they transmit, they mediate, they transmit the culture. They're writing stories, and there are people coming. There's something, I coined the phrase innovation tourism a couple of years ago. The amount of innovation tourism has become a category. And that's increasing as well, and there's growth in the air, which becomes part of a virtuous cycle. This is a thought experiment. This is imaginary, right? This is, and this is exactly what we set about 6 years ago to test, can we do that? Can we, in 3 to 5 years, work with the regional economy and within that period of time see those same outcomes? And we've been doing this long enough so that we can say, it looks good. It looks like, and I'll give you a couple of examples, it looks like it is possible if you do certain things, if you define entrepreneurship in a particular way, and you go about fostering it in a particular way, it is possible in a broad spectrum of economies within 5 years to see new economic growth that is sustainable. Now, this is not a finished experiment, so to speak. This has been going on only for 5 years. So I'm giving you, in a sense, the interim results, because I don't know if I'll live long enough to see the final results. But I'll give you one example from the city, Manizales, Colombia. Probably no one here has been to Manizales, Colombia, perhaps. Manizales is the 16th or 17th largest city in Colombia, about 500,000 people, roughly. It's characterized by having lots of universities. It's also characterized by having lots of problems. It's a lower middle income city, part of the coffee district, which was very, very wealthy until 30-some years ago when the coffee cartel collapsed and they fell on very difficult times. And the question there was, can we work with this city over a period of time, it's now been 3.5 years, to stimulate growth in a way that it becomes self-sustaining? And so I'll just give you, I know you can't read it, this is just to show you that there is an impressive infographic about this. I'll give you just some of the results, and I'm skimming over because, again, this is very complex stuff and we don't have time to go into the intricate details of how different things are measured. But of the companies participating in the program, 90% of them are experiencing 25 to 50% new growth. Some of them, exactly as I said in the thought experiment, are exporting for the first time. They're hiring new people. Most of them are good, well-paying jobs for that environment. It includes, of course, temporary hires as well. Within this city, there are hundreds and hundreds of new activities. There's one index of entrepreneurship called the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, GEM. Maybe some of you have heard that. This has been going on for about 13 or 14 years. Compares 80 countries around the world in terms of the amount of entrepreneurship. This city jumped by 100% in 50% in 1 year in total entrepreneurial activity by this measure. That's completely unprecedented in the world. So there's some outside indication that it's going in the right direction. I'm being careful to crown this as a success, but it's very positive. It looks like the patient, so to speak, is on the way to getting healthy. Banks are loaning money to clients they never loaned money for. They feel good about that. Investors are coming from other parts of the country, including Medellin, which is considered the hotbed of entrepreneurship in Colombia, in order to look for better deals. So the second example I'm going to give, so I'm going to give one more example, then I'm going to go back and give 5 very simple principles for how this happens and how this can be replicated. Are we doing time? What?
But it's okay, it's okay.
It will take about 15, I can do this in about 15 minutes.
You are in Greece.
Okay.
Take your
Sorry?
time. You are in Greece. You can take your time.
So the second project has been now going. Sorry. It is difficult. I don't know if that's a practical suggestion or not. We created something called Scale Up Milwaukee 2 years ago. And that's also, Milwaukee, probably no one here, a few have been to Milwaukee. It's right near Chicago, it's down here. This is Wisconsin, this is southeast Wisconsin. Milwaukee has about 600,000 people in the city, about 1.2 million people in the entire region. It's an economy about $90 billion economy altogether. And Scale Up Milwaukee is an attempt to replicate those findings or those impacts in a very different environment, a much more open economy, a much more advanced economy, relatively speaking, to Colombia. And here, I don't know if you can read this, but this is just 1.5 years of pilot activity. Already there's been close to, by now, $100 million of what we call economic engagement. There have been new hires, a couple of hundred new hires that are taking place. Almost all the companies within the program have accelerated growth dramatically. Some of them are exporting for the first time. banks are lending money to clients that they weren't lending money before. There's now innovation tourism coming to Milwaukee, which is creating business relationships. Next week, a delegation of 6 senior people from Brazil is coming to see what Scale Up Milwaukee is about. I invite anybody here to come to Milwaukee if you're in the U.S. or come especially for that. You'll see some unusual things if you look at the right way. And it's been a huge media success in terms of rebranding Milwaukee from a distressed city to a city that has growth in the air. I say growth in the air. The question is, why did we choose Milwaukee? Let me come back to that later, okay? Because we're tight on time. I'll get through the principles, and then we'll go from there. So, what's going on here? And I will claim this is method, it's not magic. It's a replicable system that's new because we are defining entrepreneurship in different ways, in specific ways, and engaging communities in ways in which it hasn't been done before. And so I'm going to give you what I call the 5 Ps. These are practical principles for growth. And now the frame of my conversation is, how is it possible to engage in a specific regional economy and in a short period of time, 4, 5, 6 years, let's say 5 years, to create a self-sustaining, irreversible dynamic of growth? And I realize that's almost a bombastic statement, but I think it's possible. So, principle number 1 is place. To choose a specific region. Usually, when I engage people around entrepreneurship policy or entrepreneurship ecosystems, they think of ecosystems as being characteristics of countries or of big places, but they're not. It turns out that the variation within countries, if you can measure entrepreneurship, however you measure it, the variation within most countries is much greater than the variation between countries. And I'll give you some examples. So take Massachusetts, where I live. These are 2 of the hotbeds currently of entrepreneurship. If you've been an innovation tourist to Boston, you've probably gone to the Cambridge Innovation Center, right near MIT, adjacent to MIT, and you may more recently have gone to the Boston Innovation District. These are 2 places where the concentration of investments, venture capital, companies growing, people being hired, are phenomenally high in those 2 areas. And if you go just 29 miles away, 30 minutes with no traffic, to a place called Lawrence, which nobody here has ever heard of, which 200 years ago was known for making shoes and textiles and exporting ice to South America, Lawrence is and again, I'm doing no justice to Lawrence, but no one would go there for entrepreneurship. No one would go there to build a company. No one would go there to start a company. No one would look for investments in Lawrence. It's just 29 miles away. And I'll give an example. This is the village that I was raised in, called Woods Hole, Massachusetts. Maybe some of you have been there. That's my house. Woods Hole, Massachusetts has fewer than 1,000 residents full-time. And because of the science, the concentration of science there, it has the National Academy of Sciences there, Marine Biological Laboratory, et cetera, There have been 56 Nobel laureates as of last year who have gone through, taught there, lived there. There are several who live there regularly. And since 1888, 1 business has been created. It's what I call an anti-cluster of business. Most countries would kill to have anything close to this kind of research activity, the assumption being that this kind of research innovation will automatically lead to economic activity. The only economic activity that it's led to is it employs lots of people in the laboratories. That's the only economic activity, I tell you. And so look at the differences. This is 80-some miles, this is 30 miles, and they're completely different from each other in terms of economies, even though they're all just in eastern Massachusetts. So the message is that principle number 1 is to choose a specific place. Maybe it's Athens, maybe it's even a sub-part of Athens. And you'll see why that's important. This is just an example from Milwaukee. If you look at the companies that are $10 million to $1 million, small companies, I think it's a very important segment, by the way, there are about 15,000. The stock of companies in the greater Milwaukee with $1 to $10 million revenue are 15,000. So, principle, I already said that. Principle number 2 is what I call the potential principle. This is a strategy. This is not a statement of what's good and what's bad in life. But if you want to create the economic impact and a self-sustaining cycle within a virtuous cycle, within a short period of time in a specific region, it's more effective to focus your public investment on companies who already have revenues and have the potential to grow than it is to focus on startups. I realize that's a conversation that we may have to have in more depth. And lest it be, I was interviewed last night by someone from Fortune writing an article on cities investing in startups. And I said, look, I invest in startups. Just this year, I've invested in 4 startups, and we're only in May. I have to be careful. But my wanting to invest in startups, because I think I've learned how to do that. One of them is one of my sons. Because I think I've learned how to do that. It's very different from telling you as a public to invest public money or public resources in startups. Those are 2 completely different statements. I think it's a path to wealth as long as it's one part of a diversified portfolio of assets that I have. But as a society, if you have limited resources and limited time, it's a bad investment of public resources. Again, this is a conversation. So, usually, and again, all around the world, this is true, and I'm sure it's true here as well. And I was really happy to hear Socrates say that actually the purpose is different. It's to create growth. Companies that don't just start, but they actually have growth in their minds. It's that they've internalized a template of growth. So, I'm going to skip here. I've already mentioned this. Third practical principle, people. One of the advantages of intervening in a specific region is that you can get the leaders together in a room like this and have a conversation about what is our objective, what are we trying to achieve, how fast are we trying to achieve it, and how much resources should who invest? Should who invest? So, and usually, this is my experience in most places, you can identify 15 to 20 people in a city or region of 1 million, who if they decide to do something, it happens. The fact that they almost never get together to decide to do things is germane. But if you can get them together, and that's one of the things we do, get them together and help them get aligned on a vision of entrepreneurship, of growth, that will have social and economic impact, a lot can be accomplished, including changing the culture in a very short period of time. I'm going to repeat that. One of the elements of the entrepreneurship ecosystem is the culture that supports growth, it supports making mistakes, it supports wealth creation. You can actually change that culture in a few years. It doesn't take generations. I'm going to mention this very briefly to save time. This is all online. You can Google my name, you can Google entrepreneurship ecosystems, and you'll get to these diagrams, which are very oversimplified maps, which keep in mind what are the important elements of an ecosystem that supports growth entrepreneurship. And the important thing here is that by focusing on people, and by focusing on places, and by focusing on high potential companies, you actually see that there are specific actors. These are famous people. This is just to show that there are people there. It's not abstract in getting the corporations to engage in entrepreneurship. It's not abstraction. If you represent a corporation, Specific economic actors can take specific economic action. And one of the advantages of making this very specific regionally is that you can put a face to the category. It's not a bank's doing something, it's a banker doing something. It's not entrepreneurs doing something, it's an entrepreneur doing something. So, and of course, we know that typically one of the big problems is that typically those 15 to 20 leaders in different areas are misaligned. When you use the word entrepreneurship, one of them thinks, and you didn't say this, I'm going to put this word in your mouth, some people say inclusive oftentimes means to people that everybody should be an entrepreneur. And how can everybody be an entrepreneur? It's by having lots and lots of small businesses. So maybe in one person's mind, entrepreneurship means Silicon Valley. And in another person's mind, entrepreneurship means having a micro-enterprise, or a family business, or being self-employed, or being innovative. And with those different images in mind, you can't accomplish anything. So the fourth practical principle is what I call purpose. I was an advisor to the White House and Startup America, and I asked a question that was blasphemous. It was, and when Startup America was launched in January 2009, and I asked, so how will you know when you've accomplished your objective? How much entrepreneurship is enough? They looked with blank stares. I said, what do you mean, how will we know that we've accomplished our purpose? The more the better. Well, that reflects a mistaken concept of entrepreneurship. How many doctors per 1,000 people are there in Greece?
Too many.
Too many. and not to pay taxes.
Number 2 country in the world after Cuba.
Oh, so that means I'm just guessing it's probably 5.
No,
maybe
like 13.
No, it can't be, because Cuba has 7.
All right, then it's whatever.
It's 5 or 6. Almost every country in the world has between 3 and 4 doctors per 1,000 people. I've looked at the data. By the way, if you look at the number of engineers and scientists in any country, it's also around 7 or 8 is about the maximum.
But this is
Not
an
for
average.
1,000. Sorry?
This is an average. We have different concentrations of those.
Yes, of course. I understand that. Now I'm talking nationwide.
4.4.
Sorry?
4.4, I think.
4.4. And I didn't know that, I just guessed, because nobody has more than 7.
No, 6.2. I'm sorry.
6.2. Cuba is about almost 7. So I think it's important, once you get the leadership aligned in a specific region and you have a specific idea of what you're trying to accomplish in a specific point in time in which you accomplish it, the question is, how much is enough? And we've developed a rule of thumb. It's quite audacious, but it actually works. And that is, for any region, concentrated region, every year if another company enters into a rapid growth trajectory for every 100,000 people, it arrives at a tipping point. It becomes self-sustaining and self-fulfilling and even continues to accelerate. Now, I'm not prepared to put my life on the line that that's the exactly right number. But just like there aren't any countries with 20 doctors per 1,000, I would bet that it's, in fact, there's some evidence that shows it's approximately this number. And that has implications for what you have to measure, and what you have to accomplish, where, and with whom. We're getting very, very specific here. And what that means, and I just Googled this, and I really don't know, I may have made some mistakes, but that means approximately 30 companies, regardless of the age and regardless of the sector. Shipping is a wonderful sector. There's nothing wrong just because it doesn't collapse. Shipping and tourism, 30 companies every year start growing more rapidly. Doesn't mean that there are 30 new companies formed. It means that 30 companies start growing more rapidly than before. There are various definitions. But 20% per annum is a pretty well accepted definition in the OECD and the EU and elsewhere. Revenues. Because it's very, and sometimes employees, it's very difficult to get data on anything else. So, these numbers are actually not crazy numbers.
They're achievable. And by the way, when you achieve them, they tend to, when you achieve them in a specific region, a specific city or sub-city, they tend to have impact on other sectors. They're what economists call the spillover effects, actually spill over. When I see you growing your company, neighbor who may have a 20-person company related to some services, let's say IT services, when I see you growing much more rapidly, that stimulates me to want to grow. And not every company needs to grow, only a certain percentage. So, finally, and I'll end with this, the fifth principle is what we call practicality. That is, you have to demonstrate, and we have the method to demonstrate it, you have to demonstrate in a very short period of time, in a matter of months, that this works. Going into a city and convincing a city to have another 10-year plan, another vision for 2020, another vision, long-term economic development aspiration for 2030, every place has those. In fact, most cities and most countries have a room. The Minister of Economics has a room down in the basement with all the consulting reports that have been done over the last 50 years. And one is done every 3 years because you need one for every electoral cycle. And they're gathering dust, the 5-year plans and the 10-year visions. You have to achieve practical wins in a very short period of time. That's part of the plan and one of the principles. Because if you show that, you can grow, start to grow your company at 20% additional growth this year, that changes the dynamic. Almost irreversible. So, I'm going to skip over this. Let me just show you a short, end with a short 1 minute, 20-second video. And then we can talk.
Media impressions of scale walking around the world. Economic development, stronger business.
Let me just, because this goes really fast, let me just tell you what to pay attention to. Companies, among the 15 people you'll see here, they're talking only for a sentence each. Just listen for the evidence of growth. Listen for the various signals or events of growth that they mention.
Businesses, more jobs, regional prosperity. Here comes some of the people that have been saying there is a clear path to over $1 billion of regional impact. Scale of the potential economic development. We're growing, we're about 10 in our company. We've done over 95 years. We've gone from 0 to 2 billion. Right now, we're only at $5 million a year. And within 2 years, you grow. More than double the size of our organization. We've got bigger projects. We're doing business in Mexico. It'll be about $1.5 billion. We started hiring right then. They were 40% to our top line. This was not all hands up. This is working. I'm getting excited. I'm getting involved. Things are starting to happen. Building a lot of momentum. It's happening. It's going. It's just on fire. It's all about that person.
So let me just end with these very simple takeaways. Rapid economic growth is possible in specific regions if this entrepreneurship is conceptualized as rapid growth, relatively rapid growth. If a group of leaders is convened around a specific location with specific objectives and works quickly, I can make these slides available to you, by the way, works quickly to generate visible, tangible progress. Now, I'll just comment. I understand, I spent now a week in Greece and I read. I understand that the economy and the society here is going through a lot of turmoil. I do not pretend that this method or strategy for economic development is going to solve all the problems of anywhere. But I think it's an essential element of any solution to more broad economic and social problems. So I don't want you to interpret me as saying it's a panacea. I do not view it as a panacea, and I don't view entrepreneurship as a panacea either. So I've taken too much time already. Maybe there's time for a little discussion.
Now it's time to really start. So we will have to open the floor.
So I'd like to claim myself as a big fan of the Israeli model. And the one thing I've never been able to understand is how did Israel manage to go from a socialist society which distrusted entrepreneurship to one that celebrates it? And how can we make this happen here?
And because I was there and I was involved in that, you understand the question? Is how did Israel go from a socialist society to a, what, I don't know what you call it.
That celebrates
entrepreneurial success and wealth creation. And by the way, that's created a lot of problems. There's a huge inequality in Israel.
Yes.
And it's very complicated why that inequality
But once you have wealth, it's easy to take some of it in.
The comment is a very good one because when entrepreneurship was booming, entrepreneurship in Israel started booming in the mid-1980s. Not when Startup Nation started it. Startup Nation, if you've read it, it's a misread of history. It started booming in the mid-1980s. And in the mid-1980s, in addition to there being a huge currency devaluation in the middle of that period of time, the huge parts of the economy were owned by the labor unions and the government, and wealth creation was looked down upon.
How do you change that?
And it was changed with specific examples. The specific examples are what changed it, I think, if you have to boil it down into a nutshell. A lot of things changed simultaneously. But the fact that in 1972, a technology company went public on NASDAQ, by the way, I'm not even mentioning Startup Nation. The first one went public in 1972, a medical imaging company, which is now the nexus of all the GE Healthcare's imaging business. It went public in 1972. There was a second company in the late 1970s called Cytex, which eventually became public, and really that was one of the big stimulants, where the founder, Razi, was charismatic, and everyone noticed him, and people wanted to work for him, and a lot of people left Cytex to start other companies. Investors made money in a very short period of time. With Cytex, there were 2 or 3 other companies that were very successful at the same period of time, but 3 or 4 very tangible successes, I think, were certainly a critical ingredient in that whole pathway of progress that took place. But it's a very good question. I don't think, by the way, there's an Israeli model, nor do I think there's a Silicon Valley model. There are elements of what happened in Israel that are modelable, but most of it was just chaos.
There was an impression, a perception that the Startup Nation was successful because of the migration of Jewish people from the ex-Soviet Union.
Yeah, so again, I was there, and because the people who wrote Startup Nation, we've had discussions about this. They're about 10 or 15 years younger than I am. And the revolution in entrepreneurship in Israel was over before that immigration started. It was a done deal. By 1990, 1991, everybody there in Israel knew that this was going to be a major element in the economic portfolio of the country. And so the immigration, there was not one successful company started or created or somehow by the first generation of immigrants from the former Soviet Union. Not one. We've counted. Not one. The second generation was a completely different story. The second generation had been extraordinarily involved in entrepreneurship. But the people who came, the doctors, the engineers, the teachers, the academics, they came and they worked in the streets playing violin and teaching English in 4th grade. My kids were taught English in Hebrew with people with Russian accents. These were doctors and physicists. because they couldn't get jobs. 20% of the population increased in 5 years. Imagine an influx of 2.5 million people in Greece in 5 years. That had absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with the entrepreneurship in Israel.
I just wanted to say that this impression was calculated not only from this nation, but I had the chance to go with
I'm sorry, I can't hear your voices.
I had a chance to go to Israel and visit the end-to-end ecosystem, venture capital companies, startups, etc., universities and hospitals, and they calculated exactly this perception, and I'm just wondering why.
If you go to the government and ask the government, what was your impact on this success? Do you expect any government official to say, oh, we really had no impact whatsoever, in fact, we did damage? I think the government did have a small impact, a small positive impact. I do, and I can point to specific ways in which they did. But it's usually not what the current generation thinks, because again, it was a done deal by 1985, 86, 87. Already the virtuous cycle was in place. It was just a question of time. Yeah, we're going to use the microphone, I think, a little bit here.
Yes, you mentioned certain factors that if they exist or if they are pursued, then they have a very high probability to lead to some sort of growth, the way that you define it. Is it possible, or have you thought, or have you identified any other factors that if they are present, then there's no growth to happen no matter what?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Again, I don't.
Two microphones on.
Absolutely, and I think there are certain sort of threshold, macro threshold characteristics that if you don't have them, it's going to be extremely difficult, maybe not impossible, but extremely difficult for reform to take place. And I just go back to the Israel example. A lot of the policy reforms that took place, a lot of the privatization of the economy was the result of successful entrepreneurship, not its cause. Of course, then it becomes a virtuous cycle. But as you mentioned earlier, it was a very socialist economy. The successes that broke through changed that, not the other way around. But
evidence of progress.
Yeah, evidence of progress. That's absolutely. The seeing successes is essential. But I certainly think that transparency, rule of law, access to markets, they're not absolutely necessary, but if they exist, it's a lot easier. And by the way, using the Israel example again, the markets, think about adversity. Not only was the culture against it, in many ways, not in all ways, but the culture was against it, and the system, the political economic system was against it, the markets were all thousands of miles away. When we set up companies, our beta sites would be in the United States. There was no place in Israel to have a beta site.
Thank you for the presentation. I have two questions. Don't you have the sense that you are addressed in the wrong audience in this presentation, since no one of us is eligible or decision maker to establish such an ecosystem in Greece? We're not government, we're not investment bankers. My second question is, at the end of the day, for the companies, don't you think that the most essential is know-how, financing, customers, regardless if they are in the middle of Africa or in the middle of China? Of course, it's ideal to be in Israel, but we will never be. No, none of us.
So first of all, I'll get to the second question. If I forget your first one, you remind me. The second question, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind when you sort of, and this I'm saying as an investor and as an entrepreneur and also as a teacher of entrepreneurship, when you clear away all the smoke, there are sort of three things that are important. And the first one is customers. Having access to a customer is by far the most, or to markets, but in specific customers, is by far the most important characteristic and the asset of access to customers is by far the most important asset in any particular environment. So that's number one. The second is access to human capital. If you look anywhere around the world, whether it's Bangalore, or whether it's Taiwan, or whether it's Silicon Valley, or whether it's Israel or Boston, the oversupply of talented capital, of human capital, as an extraordinarily important stimulus. So coming back to your first point, which I do remember, is I asked who this audience was when I started. You may be right, it's the wrong audience. That's possible, and I'm happy to maybe address to the right audience, whoever that is.
I think, sorry to intervene, I just think that it is the right audience. Because, you know, this is one outcome of the presentation that I really got. And actually it came strong again in my mind, is the fact that the answer is not a macro answer, it's a micro answer. It has to do with each one of us. You know, it's small 1 yard wins every day. This one will become the startup, that will become the scale up, that will grow the economy. If there was somebody from one ministry today, or it was somebody from, I don't know, the City of Athens is here, and we are with the City of Athens, this is people who just made it happen. Right? This place, which is actually a physical hub, it's not something else, but it's a physical hub. So I believe that this is the right audience. I mean, the people that I know, around half of them I know them here, they are the very right audience. Okay, they are changing leaders and they are drivers. You want to say something?
Let us present who we are, because half of the audience is not the usual audience that comes to American synergies events, and maybe more take especially for them. Thank you, Dan, for this. Who we are? Yeah, please. Yeah. Thank you. Let's have you know, there's a bunch of industry associations, from microelectronics, mobile applications, space technologies in this, and biomedical technologies, open source and open technologies, and the Startup Association, which stands for about 300 members, 300 companies, some of them very small, and some quite big. The total revenue of our companies is about $1 billion. We have at least 3 companies over 300 million euros per year, and with the market value of about currently 400 million. 2 of them are listed on the London Stock Exchange. And in total, our knowledge-based workers are more than 2,000 highly qualified academically and professionally. Currently, here we represent roughly 0.7% of Greece's GDP, which is high. And our associations try to use this into to create the beginning of an ecosystem, to recreate an ecosystem. Because, you know, Athens was historically an ecosystem of creation, entrepreneurial creation, cultural creation, and this very space that we stay now was a crossroad between the roads of commerce in the north, the roads of culture, and the ancient agora lies behind us. So, what we fear is that we cannot grow this ecosystem if half of the ecosystem participants go with it. That's the current state of things. Of course, we are not afraid for our members to be global players and have offices all around the world. We have currently presence in more than 40 countries. But what we see that we need better base, we need better territory in Athens. So, not only in Athens, but also the other cities that you mentioned here. And there we try with the local governments to create better conditions for growing the ecosystem. Without wanting to go in more detail, I would like to say that we have a bottom-up
As some of you know that with the previous government, we had severe efforts to bring in contact a very good team from Israel to bring the experience of how Israel 15 years ago pushed things forward and tried to and created a high-tech environment in the desert. This team.
Sorry, that already said that. But it was created out of chaos. So it's not a matter of getting the top down or the bottom up, getting the citizens with the government, etc. Actually, he pointed out that we have to focus on a regional level. Okay, sorry to interrupt.
Thank you. The bottom-up approach is that if the players of the ecosystem understand that they have common interests in doing actions for growing it, sometimes it moves things much better. We have tried the bottom-up approach, and we don't think that it works. We have tried to cut down. We many of you may have read in the newspapers that during the Prime Minister trip in Israel 3 years ago, we together with the Minister of Development and our association, we signed an agreement between the Greek government and Israel Organization for Technology for know-how exchanging and growing on building those projects. And we had for 1 year an effort for very specific team from Israel, including Isenberg and some of us. Things didn't move. Governments have to change, ministers change, and things have to start again from the beginning. But we think that the best approach is to mobilize the stakeholders of the ecosystem. That's our approach. That's why we asked them to come here and talk and discuss with all of us those aspects. It's a slide with the growth potential and the what we know, and I close here, is that in Greece we have the highest standard pool, one of the best standard pools in Europe, and we have one of the highest percentage of tech and science workers per capita. It's much better than France, Netherlands, and Germany. It's unused, unexploited. With many problems, and now we all know that most of them are trying to find their way outside. So,
I think that that's unemployment, right? I'm just reading unemployment. That's actually a huge asset, a tremendously huge asset. If in Bangalore in late 1970s, one of the big triggers of the BPO industry, which now employs tens of millions of people in India, one of the big triggers was the fact that IBM withdrew from India. In 1977, the government passed a law requiring local ownership of foreign companies. And IBM said no, and they left. And then thousands of customer service engineers and software programmers were left in Bangalore, many of whom fed the BPO industry. Lo and behold, 1979, 1980, the BPOs started coming up. In Israel, the same thing happened. And this, I'm sure, very few government people will say this. But in 1987, there was a project until 1987, like August 1987, called the Levy Project, which was to create Israel's own F-16 fighter pilot. And in August 1987, it was canceled overnight by the parliament. And thousands of the best trained and most experienced project managers, administrators, technical people, developers flooded the labor market. Lo and behold, in 1989 and 1990, magically out of nowhere, all these companies are being formed with great business models and great technology. This happens everywhere in the world. In Finland, it's happening as we see it in front of our eyes. The collapse of Nokia has created a huge stimulus. In 2009, 2008-9, the investment banks in the United States, in New York, all fired hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. And lo and behold, it's now the second largest concentration of venture capital in the United States, in the world.
Sorry. there's a fundamental difference, because what you're talking about is an educated workforce that you can use to build up. And what we have in Greece is basically university graduates. So, and you understand the difference, right? So it's not that somebody can come in and say, I have an educated workforce, they're sitting there, they're doing nothing, here's my opportunity, I grab them and I go. It's actually, and the problem is that if you look at the entrepreneurs, we haven't gone through 2 or 3, 4 cycles. So, we still think that the government will save us. We still haven't gotten the point that the government can themselves, right? I mean, I don't know a single example in any economy that grew where the government was a driver. If you have, fantastic. But, right, especially in innovation, because here it's about innovation, right? It's not about the other things. So, and a very interesting example about Greece is you didn't bring up Teva as an example in Israel, which drove things, right? And that's kind of in Greece, we have
big pharmaceutical.
No, generics. We have big generics. So, there are at least 5 groups in Greece that would have done Actavis, but because they just don't look far, beyond the Balkans, they will never do.
Workable did. Workable is a spin-off from Upstream. There is a big company that just got some money. And the important thing is that it's exactly the story that we're talking about. Some people who worked in Upstream, they just spin out. They did not do the core business, which is, I suppose, social media, marketing, but it's like HR. So they worked out of the HR business. This is workable. They just got millions, and they're working with Facebook globally. So it can be done. And this is what we're doing. I fully agree on one thing of what you're saying. It is a micro thing. It's each one of us. We shouldn't expect even 1 penny from, not even 1 penny, even 1 action from the government. We just shouldn't care. All the good examples in Greece, there is not even one of them. There are 10, 15 companies that really make it scale up. 30 companies that really, there is not even one of them that it was done the old-fashioned way. That's why we have a small buffer here. We need a startup before we go to the scale, because we don't have a startup at the moment.
You made an argument before between innovation and entrepreneurship. Also in the case of Israel, we have derived a huge degree of, I don't remember the term, but it's interrelated entrepreneurship with research and development, and therefore innovation. So, as well as in the case, as Yannis said, in Greece at that time, you had entrepreneurship because you have R&D as well, you had people researching. That brought us innovation, so it's 2 entities that actually coexist and go by hand. So what you said before, that in the long-term innovation it's better than entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial skills, I don't believe it's the case. It's something that fits the other on the same basis and it goes along.
Yeah, I don't want to get into the sort of technical nuances of that. I think that innovation is an asset that entrepreneurs use more than anything else. But I think Kevin is a very good example. If you look at the most impactful companies in Israel, 2 or 3 of them are arguably not technology companies at all. Teva has an innovative business, but most of its value is from generics. And the other huge company in Israel is Isenberg, Israel Carbide. I worked very closely with them. They were acquired by Warren Buffett for about $8 billion 10 years ago. I think these are the big companies. There are also some others.
Questions in the back?
But I want to just comment one thing. I think that the way you said it, Socrates, is exactly right. I think entrepreneurs should feel exactly the way you feel, that we will succeed despite or without the government. But I think that's different from saying the government doesn't have a role. I think there is a very enlightened role. Entrepreneurs should not think that government's the driver. But government still has an important role to play, even though we may not call it the driver. It's part of the ecosystem. Regulation is part of the ecosystem. Permitting, tax structures are all part of the ecosystem.
Other questions?
comments, clarifications. You know, this guy is leaving, so we must.
Συγχαρητήρια κύριε Σοκράτη που μας εγώ έχω πει για την επιλογή σας για τον κύριο Φιφό που δίπλα είχαμε, όχι όλοι.
Scaling down. What should start a company do? It focus on innovation and focus on execution of the business.
So, please don't confuse what I said about the prescriptions that I gave as necessarily prescriptions for entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs should do what they think is valuable, not what I think is valuable, and not what he thinks or the government thinks. Entrepreneurs should pursue value creation in a way that seems the most effective for them. And it's a very personal process. So I don't want to be misconstrued as telling entrepreneurs what they should be doing. In many ways, entrepreneurs, that's why my book is called Worthless, Impossible, and Stupid. Because many of the real successes are when you look back on them, they look really great. But when they're happening, most smart people think that they're stupid things to do. So I try to avoid being put in a position of saying, where are the hot areas of entrepreneurship? I let the entrepreneurs decide that. Because usually what they decide are the hot areas are not what I think are the hot areas, or the right ways.
If I hadn't listened carefully, I would understand that you are against startups as a development model for the country. You rather...
Yes, I am. Yes. I want to be clear about that. If your resources are limited, my assumption is that public resources are limited. Maybe even non-existent. That the investment of public resources in encouraging people to start companies is not a good investment. That's not saying that you shouldn't start companies, or that I shouldn't start companies, or that you should. That's saying as a public investment, it's a bad investment because it will happen anyway. It will happen because people say, I want to start my company because I perceive there's a huge value that can be created. Not because you, the government, are giving me some tax credit.
This is something that we continuously pitch, as a Hellenic Startup Association. This is something we continuously pitch. We should not wait for government money to do our business or to start our business. If we want government money, they will have to come as bonus later, the ESPAs, etc., etc. The best money, the only money are the client's money, the customer's money, no other money. No VC money, nothing. And there's another very interesting point that I saw that when we're talking about entrepreneurship, we're talking about growth, and only growth. Growth, we have to grow. A successful startup is not the ones that raised money. They raised money to grow. They did not just raise money, to have, a nice house or whatever. These things are things that we need. This is what we talk about transformation. We need to transform the way we are thinking. Still, 3 years later, we didn't do a good job. We did a terrible job. Hellenic Startup Association and all the mentors and all the coaches and all the startup events, etc., we did a terrible job. We still don't get it that the most important thing for us is to grow. Maybe scale-up will come later as a concept, yes, because we don't have, the previous model that we had is not good enough to support scale-ups. Yes, correct. And it's not only technology, it's in all sectors. But the important thing for us is that we start to understand that we need to transform on a micro level, as each one of us grow, and then go to the governments, and they will come to us. The important things that they will come to us. Now, I'm not sure if there are any more questions. I think you should get a little bit tired as well, and it's around 2 hours now. We want to thank you very much for that. It was a please correct me if I'm wrong. It was a really good audience, which was a very nice tennis match here. And we'd like to thank you very much. Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ που ήρθατε μέσα στη ζέστη και στη μέση της ημέρας και ελπίζουμε έτσι να μπορούμε να κάνουμε άλλα καλύτερα και να είστε όλοι μαζί μας. Ευχαριστούμε πολύ.